Шановні колеги, ми продовжуємо роботу. Тема наступної події.
We continue our work, and the topic of current press briefing is public funding of political parties. We have Oleksiy Koshel, CEO of All-Ukrainian NGO Committee of Voters of Ukraine, and Mr. Denis Rybachok, analyst of the same organization. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Political parties had to submit their financial reports about the use of state funding by February 9th. As of now, at NAZK website, you won't find more than 9 such financial reports, but they still have time, but by February 19th. But the law provides that the political parties have to publicize such financial reports on their websites. As of now, we have all the financial reports from big parties except Radical Party and opposition bloc on their websites. The financial funding had started in mid last year. In the year 2017 provides 4,342,000,000 to political parties. It's enough for political parties. If you look at our neighbor in Poland, we observe that in Poland, the parties are funded per one voter, one zloty. In Ukrainian, much bigger money are provided for each party per one voter, and amounts to 13 hryvnia, which is higher than 1 zloty. While for museums and libraries, only 395 million are allocated from the budget. This means that political parties can work properly, build up their networks, not worse than the libraries, finance, analytical centers, civil society organizations, under parties, etc. The state funding is carrying out the function of funding political parties to prevent oligarch funding. The Voters Committee had analyzed reports from political parties about the funds use, except Radical Party and opposition bloc, who haven't published their reports. We have analyzed all of them. Actually, non-publication of financial report is violation of the law. Now, our major findings from the survey. It shows the amount of money allocated by parties for different purposes. Each second hryvnia received from the state was spent by political parties for political advertising to mass media. Самопоміч, People's Front, and Radical Party had spent more than 60 million hryvnia. So the parties spent money not for building up the party, but for political advertising. 67% were used by People's Front, by different split into TV, radio, and printed media. The advertising, the most massive advertising was held in December, when Arseniy Yatsenyuk congratulated people with the New Year. Samopomich used almost 50% of their money for political advertising. The biggest amount of money, 17 million hryvnia, was spent for party newspaper. And they raised the circulation and one of the releases of this new newspaper amounted to 6 million copies. This is big, huge circulation for Ukraine. This party used 9.9 million hryvnia for paper, more than 6 for printing, and only 600 hryvnia for dissemination of this party newspaper. We assume that, of course, parties can print some announcements, newspapers, leaflets, advertising, etc. But now we see extremely six figures. It seems to me that this newspaper can just stay in a warehouse somewhere instead of dissemination. That's why we believe that NAZK should double-check this abnormal figures of circulation and try to understand whether the newspaper really reached the voters. The third anti-leader in spending government funds for media purposes. This was Oleg Lashko's party. Although they have no printed report, but we observed the massive advertising of this party on TV, and the leaders confirmed that that TV advertising was made on the account of state money, and probably when they publish their report, we will see how big figures were spent for this. In line with Ukrainian legislation, the state funding is intended for development of political parties, for development of regional structures, for wages, for analytical expert centers, for direct work with voters, public hearings, development of alternative policy solutions, etc., while spending on advertising is just eating out. It looks like parents give money to their teenager son for hot lunch while he wastes them in gambling machines. And that's why we had registered a draft law about amendments to the law on political parties, draft number 6026. And we encourage the parliament pass this legislative amendments as soon as possible, which will regulate the expenses which for which state money could be spent, and will limit political advertising. And one more thing which we have done. We have parties working in shadow. Political People's Front and the Oleksiy party looks like not having any party branch with the status of legal entity. The parties legally stated this. The People's Front keeps saying that they have 333 branches of the local branches of their party, but they are not registered as legal entities, which means that they cannot carry out any economic operations or transactions, pay money, etc., pay money to people, to staff, etc. So either they work in shadow format or use half legal schemes how money could be used, either via civil society foundations, something like that. The law provides, although that all the civil society organizations also have to present their reports to NAZK, stating the sources of their income.
At the same time, we mentioned some positive issues in accordance with our analysis. I would like to emphasize two things. First, most money, besides the advertisement, some political parties used for development of local communities, and also political parties started finally to officially employ their employees. As to expenditures for local communities, that was one of the key purposes of the state budgeting. And if you look at the parties that spent most, the leader is the Petro Poroshenko bloc, which spent 14 million out of 51 million for that quarter of the money. The Petro Poroshenko bloc used for regional development. Also, the Committee of Voters of Ukraine mentioned that the parliamentary parties are in the process of active forming of regional structures. In 2015, Petro Poroshenko bloc registered 1,077 new centers, talking about the distribution of payments. Here we see some disproportion. Who will the central office of the party allocate more money to, who less, and what will be the criteria? In the Petro Poroshenko bloc, we saw some disbalance. For example, Mykolaievska territorial organization of the party received from the budget almost 1 million hryvnias. Next to it, Khersonska organization received less than 300,000. The Committee of Voters of Ukraine in its draft mentions and suggests to establish a clear mechanism of distribution of money between the local organizations of political parties. We suggest that 70% of money the party spent for development of local organizations and 30% should be used for the central apparatus. Most of the money a lot of money was used by Batькivщина for the development of local organizations. Most of money was spent for leasing the premises. 6 million out of 19 were used for that. Also, political parties started officially employing their people. If we look at the report of the People's Front, in the second quarter of 2016, we will not see a single officially registered person. There was always zero. But after the party received state financing, we see that in regional and municipal organization, officially they have 579 people working, and 22 are working officially in the central headquarters of the party. We see that there are some positive results of state funding. Even previously, the party had some employees, but that was a shadow activity. Now it's all legalized. But at the same time, we have one negative conclusion. The official salary in political parties is at very low level. In average, the common employee receives from 3 to 3,500 hryvnias a month. And that's characteristic for all political forces. But there are grounds to believe that probably they are not receiving so little money. So most probably we see the situation when people receive money in unofficially, but officially we see only very low figures. But we believe that some funds of political parties are in shadow, still in shadow. Thank you. And one more positive thing, we examined the first stages of public financing in eastern neighbors. In Ukraine, we didn't have any big scandals. In June 2013 in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza published information about the reports on public funding of political parties, and there was a big scandal when the parties were spending a lot of money, 250,000 zloty. It's like $30,000-$40,000 were used for expensive suits, shoes, for alcohol and restaurant. And there was a big scandal. And in Poland, there was a referendum on whether it is feasible to finance parties, because only everything's not perfect, but it's not very tragic. We would like to emphasize how important it is to finance political parties. The law should be improved. We see that talking about the number of party organizations, local organizations, the leader is Batьківщина. BPP spends about 20-25%, and they increase the number of local organizations. But according to the law, there will be not less than 70% spent for local organizations. This will be this incentive for the development of local organizations. Any questions? Introduce yourself. Lucas, Channel 24, did you research only parliamentary parties? Yes, only parliamentary parties, those that received public state funding. Other parties do not receive state funding. And now, two questions. The Institute of Mass Information published the data that People's Front is officially buying just some people who are not really members. The reports that we received, there are some articles like propaganda, and Petro Poroshenko blog spent 10 million hryvnias. We have not received any detailed information on that. As to official reports, I believe that it will be possible to understand whether the material was published as a promotion or not, but we received a very serious instrument of control of the work of the political parties. No, I didn't see this information. Meeting with the voters, that is not present in the reports of the political parties. The political parties shouldn't mention how much money they spend for meeting with the voters, but they do have such activity. It's included in other parts of the report. If we take, for example, the expenditures of Samopovich, we see that 1.5 million was used to organize different activities. So these were probably meetings with voters. But if we look at what percentage of expenditures was used for interaction with voters, it will be about 10-20%, not more. Mostly that's advertisement, and in some cases it's development of local organization, but direct communication with voters is not a priority. Channel 24.
Anna Kalushna, I wish to ask whether it is fair when the money goes depending on the number of voters, whether there were any attempts to deprive some political party from money. This is the law. I think it's fair distribution in line with voters, which reflects how popular this or that political party is among the voters. Then, when the parties received money in line with the law, this was done in line with the rather vague law, and which allocates money for the statute activities of the party, which is rather vague formulation. And partially those money was spent on elections because in December we had additional elections in some places, and this is reflected by my publication of newspaper. I would like to specify whether we can create some provision making it impossible for political parties from bribing voters. It's not possible. I think that this issue has to be regulated by the maturity of voters' culture. But if the parliament amends the legislation requiring to spend 70% of their money for regional branches, then by the end of the year, parties will go to the regions, and thus we will force them to build up local divisions. Then they must then expert views. Analytical centers are a powerful tool in developing policies. The expert centers should contribute to development of expert centers in the regions, contributing to development of local strategies, budgets, etc. Valery Kravchuk, what could be the responsibility imposed upon Lashko if he won't submit that funding, and the OPA bloc, opposition bloc, whether they, in case they did not get any state funding, whether they are still obliged by this law to publish their report. Upper block, which rejects to get state funding, I think this is the intention to undermine the idea of state funding, and this prevents from public scrutiny, civil society scrutiny of the party's work, and keeping it under control. As for bloc, in our draft law, we have separate section allowing state money to be act on a tour and military service of Ukraine. This is the only one charity allowed for the parties. If the parties think that as for radical party and its responsibility, will it be just moral or administrative punishment? The non-compliance of radical party with legislation should be punished with administrative responsibility, that is, with the fine amounting to 2,000 hryvnia. But actually, everything will depend on the solution of NAZK. Olga Komarova, Radio Liberty. Major objective of state funding was to diminish the impact of the oligarchs on parties, but actually the parties got additional nourishing from pockets of Ukrainians. So how do the citizens benefit from this? And from the party's income, how much does this state money amount? For Samopomich, Petro Poroshenko, and the People's Front, state funding amounts to 89% of their funding. And that's enough amount allowing parties to be independent from oligarchs in intra voting period. In the periods of votes, I guess there might be political advertising financed by oligarchs. Dear colleagues, any further questions? Since there are no further questions, thank you.